I lied. I lied a lot.
You might a ton.
Ton. Three, two, one. Welcome to the Lightforge. This is Adwukta.
This is Merps, and this is a Lightforge that once again is recorded just a little bit early. We are recording this on Friday evening, so if something crazy happens Saturday or Sunday, just recognize that it won't be on the Lightforge. So you guys don't freak out or basically consider us like just totally not in touch with society, which I
Yeah.
guess
The
kind of
world could end tomorrow. And
it
then
could.
on Sunday, we'd release, or like on Monday, we'd release the Lightforge. And it'd be like, so guys, this is how you play Hearthstone.
Right. And
Um,
everyone's like, why aren't they talking about the radioactive zombies that we're all running away from?
just
But
not relevant to the Hearthstone arena scene.
no, not really. Although it might spawn a faster meta because you always have to be ready
Oh,
to
that's
leave your chair
true. It's
because
gonna
those
be
zombies.
the mobile meta.
Right, right, exactly. It's the
E-
mobile meta.
Easy wins.
Yeah, and Nozdormu just like shoots way up, like, oh man. Anyways, so we're going to talk about something a little bit more conceptual today, because I think for quite a few weeks we focused on stuff that's been very meta specific,
Like
right?
stuff, like real solid stuff that you can do stuff with.
Right, right.
Like
So
the meat and potatoes of Hearthstone Arena.
there you go. We've given you guys our own thoughts. We've also had Shady on, and he's given like a very detailed breakdown on like classes that he thinks is good, sort of good play styles, how you guys should be drafting as well. So now we're just going to take a step back and talk about something general and something that everyone will go through if you just play Hearthstone Arena, constructed, or just do anything in life, which is suck, which is
Yes.
not do well and just struggle, right?
Just
Um,
endless amounts of failure. We're not talking about losing a game or like getting an 0-3 run. Like this is not like, how to learn from your mistakes. Well, it's kind of like that. This is like how to learn when you suck. Like you
right.
may not have sucked before. You may be totally fine in the future, but for now, for this short period of time, you are at the bottom of your personal your personal things, right? We were talking about life management last week, which is all fine and good on the board and making sure you don't die. But this is going to be about like Hearthstone Arena career management, right? Of
Basically.
your record. Everyone goes into a slump, and this is going to be how you get out of it and become a better player for the future.
Right. And I will say, I think this is very topical. Number one, because I'm sort of in a mini slump myself.
You're in a
For
slump
those,
because you play Warrior half the time. That's not a
that,
slump. That's called
that was one
playing
of my
Warrior
caveats.
half the
That
time.
is one of my caveats, and one thing I was going to bring. But also, I see this sentiment more often, like in the forums, right, and on Reddit.
Yes,
People are
I
just
have
like,
seen it like more often than even 7.1. Like this
yeah,
meta has taken a lot of people for a loop, and that makes sense. This is really the largest. I think this is the biggest meta shift that's happened since 7.1.
yeah, and you see a lot of people frustrated. You see a lot of posts like, my average wins went from 6 to now 4. I don't understand why, or just like, I'm so frustrated now. We see a lot of these posts. So what I want to talk about today is just sort of things you need to sort of tell yourself when this is happening, right? Just to get you in the right mindset, and then what you can actually proactively do to get yourself out of it, right?
Okay, so
So
there's like a bunch of different ways to look at the game. I think I focus a lot on like technicals and like where the meta is because that's how the game is, right? You look at a game what it is, but in reality, like you talk to any like person who plays games or athletes or esports athletes, or and when I say athletes I meant like physical athletes or esports athletes or poker players and whatever, and your mindset like causes as much wins and losses as your actual skills. Like good players that are currently in a bad mindset will do quite significantly poorer. Like that's not to say like if you're playing FPS you're gonna like be able to, as a normal player, be able to beat the pros, like just because you're having a good mental day and they're not. But in a game like Hearthstone, where a lot of it is like decision making and guessing and reading and like all those things, your feel of the game and your confidence level, all that like plays really heavily into whether you're having a good like month or a bad month, right? Like on an individual game basis, RNG has a lot of effect. The deck you're using has a lot of effect. What your matchups are has a lot of effect. But on a, if you're doing this for like 12 runs, like 15 runs, and you're like, hey, I used to average 5 wins, now I average 3.5 in this meta. Well, something's up, right? And we've told you technically what you should be doing and what you should be looking out for, but this is going to be the process piece to help you like put that into action.
Right. And part of this is to just, get you in the right mindset, because mindset is important and tilt happens, right? People get tilted. And then once you are in that slump, it is easy for people to stay there because of stubbornness, because of lack of, just clarity, right? So let's sort of go through a couple of things that I think initially you need to do to get yourself in the right mindset. So obviously you're at the point where you're just like, okay, I used to average X, now I average like X minus 2, right? And this is, so first of all, just check to see if your sample size is big enough. If you're saying, oh, I'm not averaging 3, and it's like 3 wins over 3 runs, and like 2 of them happens to be Warrior, for example, don't worry about it, right? Because I see some people talk about something like, it's like, oh man, my average for these 5 or 6 runs is horrible. That's just too small of a sample, right? Like a lot can happen during that time. Wasn't there like a span where Crip went like 0-3, like 2-3, and then 1-3 and 1-3 or something?
Yeah, I'm sure like for anybody who plays like high volume, like, arenas like Crip or Huff or Asma, everybody's gone through like just ridiculously bad runs. There was once where I went like I think I back-to-back 0-3s or like a 0-3 and a 1-3 or something, right? And with like decent decks, and not like even crappy decks. This is going to happen to everybody, and that's not what we're talking about. Like, we're talking about like actual prolonged like slumps, where you're just like something's not right with like your actual interaction with the meta.
Right. And then after that point, so after you see like, let's say in the span of 20 runs, your average just plummets, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
well, what would you say is plummet? Let's I would say anything 20% or more is a significant like dip. So yeah, I know we're talking like pretty large numbers here. Like you go from 5 wins to 3 wins, it's a 40% dip. But if you go from like 7 wins to like 5.8 wins, for example, that's a huge dip too.
Right. So I think that's a good benchmark, because I think that's something we do need to set. Otherwise, when we say, oh, if your average goes down, people are like, exactly how much, right? So the first step is just acceptance. And I'll say this.
Wow, this is like the reverse of the stages of grief.
I know. The first step is acceptance, because when you're doing something like this, especially if you are, let's say, a 7-win average player, 7.5 win average player, it's easy for you to say, I'm just getting unlucky, right? Or like, I've just been facing, some ridiculous opponents, and I'm sure that is a percentage of it, right? I'm sure that's
it's always the opposite. Like the people who play a ton of arena and average like 7 wins, like they'll get like 10 like bad runs in a row and they'll like shrug it off. And then people who play like, 1 run a week and get like 4 bad runs in a row and average like, 4 wins, and they're now averaging like 3, they like freak out, right? Like right. I feel like that's a pretty common pattern. And both sides need to realize what may or may not be happening. Like the 7-win player may need to really evaluate whether they're actually in a slump. And the 4-win player who has dropped to 3 wins over the course of 4 runs should probably not worry about it too much yet.
Right. But the first thing, and I think this is very important, not just for this process, but overall for Hearthstone improvement, is just identify that you have a lot of control in your hands, right? And if you're seeing this dip in a large enough sample size, something that you're doing is suboptimal. And that is just the first step. So I would say past that point, you want to look back. If you're tracking, if you're not tracking, well, you can't really do this, but you should also think about tracking like past this point because that's helpful. But if you have been tracking, like look back and see, like, do you notice a trend? Right? Maybe like your mage is just down by a little bit, your paladin is just down by a little bit, but your priest is way down, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like your priest is actually dragging you down. And then let's look for some simple trends here. Like this should not be a process that takes you a long time. You're not looking at it's like, well, how many average 2 drops did I like? We
Yeah.
don't have to analyze that,
And most people won't have like that much sample size for like all the classes, but like take the classes you're playing a lot, right? And generally, if you're doing like less well and you're trying to focus on your game, you should be limiting your classes anyway, right? Like as a first step, and then you'll get more data as you play.
Right. So go through if you can, and if you can't because you just don't have VODs because you're not a streamer, or if you haven't tracked using like a deck tracker kind of thing, then I would definitely advise that for the future. So after you do that and just look at basic, huge general trends, spend a few minutes doing that. The big thing to remember is just don't panic because a lot of people, once they see, like, once they've identified this, they're just like, I'm not doing well. Everything has to be 180 now,
Mm-hmm.
Like I
Mm-hmm.
used to draft greedy.
Yeah.
I got to go fast now. And with hunters, I used to go fast. Let's go
Control
control.
Hunter.
Like,
Hashtag Control Hunter. Yes, please do that, guys.
because at this point, I see a lot of people just trying to just be like, I really have to change things. So
Mm-hmm.
when I sort of struggle with a meta, and I've struggled quite a bit. I remember in Old Gods, I struggled a lot at the beginning
Yeah.
for actually no reason.
Yeah,
I never identified it.
I was about to say that was such a weird time that you were struggling because I remember it was like whole month. I was like, "What is happening?" And you're like, "I don't know." And I'm like, the meta is just like more taunty, right? Like that's all that's happened with the freaking meta. Like it
Yeah,
wasn't like the cards were weird. It wasn't much happening.
and then I did fine
Yeah,
after that as
yeah.
well.
Like a month later, it was like just back to normal.
Yeah, it was very strange. But so what happens when your average goes down, and then you look to see if there's trends afterwards? Don't do anything dramatic. I would say the first step is to just play a couple of runs, or a few runs, and then just really try to
Mm-hmm.
notice what like analyze what you're going for. How are you defining the meta? Because a lot of times when you're playing, you're not actively saying to yourself, how am I defining the meta?
Right.
How am I defining these matchups? So get those definitions in mind. And I know this sounds tedious, especially for those people, as you defined, who play like one run every single week, right? But if we're talking about real improvement in the arena, this is going to be directed towards those grinders, right?
Well, no, it's directed towards everyone. You can just
It's directed
there's
towards
a difference
everyone,
between
but
like playing and being like, oh, see what happens, or like I'll test stuff, or
right,
like I'm
right.
just having fun, and being like serious where you're like, oh, I'm gonna think through everything. But this is I wouldn't call it even like more serious than a serious run. It's probably less serious. It's like the diagnostic mode, right? Where as you're
Yeah,
playing a
yeah.
run, you're like, huh, that game, whether I won or lost, did I go fast enough? Like the easiest thing I think to do, the two easiest things. We'll do 3 easiest things. Okay. The 3 things I look for in a meta, right, when I'm diagnosing myself. One
Hmm.
is speed. It's easy because you just basically count how many cards are in your hand at the end of everything, whether you win or not. You're like, oh, did I go a little too fast? And you went a little too fast if either you lose because you've sacrificed too many resources and you weren't like able to take it for the long haul, or you went a little too fast because you had to top deck your way into an answer, and that's not really like how your deck operates, and you had chances to like hero power or like whatever, and you didn't take it. And you play too slow if you had chances to tempo, you didn't take it, and you end up with like more cards in your hand by the time you win or lose. So that's a good gauge of how fast or slow to be. And it's helpful to do that with like similar types of classes, right? So if you like keep playing all the different classes or all the different archetypes, like, one after the other, it's not as helpful to build up this baseline. But if you just say like, Yeah, I mean, I like to use mid range for my centering because it's literally in the middle. And once I figure out where the middle of mid range would be, I know where control is and where aggro is, and I just have to figure out how far into control and aggro each side is going in the meta. And then you're kind of good. So that's, I think, the easiest thing to look for, because you don't even have to think about it like when you're playing the game. You just have to look about it at the end of the game, looking at the results and the number of cards in your hand.
Yeah. So I think what Advocate says is really good, especially it's specific, right? It's like
Mhm.
specifically what you're looking for in terms of meta definition and
Yeah.
like refinement.
And it's
So
relative to your deck, right? Because we could keep saying like, "Oh, the meta's slow. You should be greedier," but maybe you're already a really freaking greedy player. You just don't know it. So you getting greedier doesn't actually help, right? Like we say it as in like,
right,
if you've been generally following how we play this game, you should get greedier, right?
yeah,
Like, but not everyone plays the way we do, or maybe you're trying to play the way we do, but you were actually like, two cards greedier than we were normally. Well, now maybe you're just the right amount of greed, but you've been listening to us, and you've gotten even greedier, and it's too much, right? Like, so that's a good way to diagnose your own thing.
yeah, I think so. So during these first few runs, it's all about defining your play, right? It's not about sort of like making big changes. Like I wouldn't make any big changes. I would just say it's like, okay, here's how I think of the meta, and here is what I am doing so far. Like really define it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then afterwards, I think this is the point in which you can, I'll call it fast forward your meta knowledge by like going to streams and watching people who are having success. For example, we had Shady Bunny on, and he gave us his average. He's doing quite well in this meta, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's playing priest. He's doing well. He's doing well with mage as well. And this is a good opportunity, after you've sort of diagnosed your meta, your definition of the meta, to go over to Shady Bunny stream, to like Dread stream. I think he's doing quite well, and just see, okay, how are they defining the meta? How are they playing it? Not only what classes they prefer, but sort of how they're drafting and how they're playing the classes. So,
Yeah.
but it's important that you do that afterwards. Like you
Yes.
want to make sure you know what you're currently doing, and then you do the comparison to what other people are doing. And this is also just important
And
for
look at
learning in
yeah,
general.
like look at their drafts when you're looking at it, because if you've done a couple drafts, like you've everyone meets with the same situation, right? Like you're missing a 3 drop. You have like one 3 drop and it's pick 16. Do you take the 3 drop and like not take the good card, or like you have like 3 large cards by pick 8? Do you take another large card at that point, or like these are choices that happen like every like other draft will have it, and then you can see how streamers deal with it, and you'll notice that streamers don't deal with it consistently across metas because you're supposed to draft differently depending on the different metas. And so I think that's a good way to kind of, again, like figure out a way to do things and then do it relative to what you're doing, right? Rather than just copying a particular streamer like one for one. Like, I watch Dreads have a deck with 7 drops. So I will make a deck with 8 7 drops now. Like, yeah, you see a few of these drafts and you're like, oh, so this is the range of things that work. And the streamers will usually tell you like why they're taking so many 7 drops or why they don't think they need so many 7 drops. Like one of the basic things, and it's been true for Warrior for a while now, is Warriors don't need large drops. Why? Because each Warrior weapon is 2 cards of card advantage if you can be on the board. So that's an insane card advantage edge that no other class has. So they lose some in the hero power, but if they have the good weapons, then they don't need big cards.
Yep. So that's what you should do next. I'm not saying like, don't watch any streams until this point. Like you just, it's about a shift in focus, right? So after you go to the streams and you figure out, oh, this is what Shady Bunny is doing, this is what Dreads is doing, etc. Whoever you like to watch. Now it's time to focus on fixing your game or tweaking your game. But once again, so after you've identified sort of what you're doing and what you should be doing, make sure that you when you're fixing something or tweaking something, you do it one at a time or just a few at a time, and you can sort of focus this on a class, for example, or you can focus it on an ideal, right? So you could just say, I'm going to improve mage, and I see that I played mage this one way, I'm going to play mage this other way. You can focus on that, or you can just focus on something a bit broader and conceptual. Like, you know what, I was sort of um, undervaluing removals, right? And now
Mm,
I'm just going to pick every single, well, maybe not every single remove, but
a
I'm
lot
now going
more.
to, yeah, I'm going to pick them a lot more because that's where the meta is going. It's more reactive. So, and this depends on what you need to improve and also just the way that you think about these things. But make sure you sort of focus on this one at a time, or just a few at a time. If you have like a lot of things you want to work on, though, don't do it all at once. It's too confusing. And the way that you implement it, you're going to have to be thinking about all of these things at once. It's not going to be great. And because during this process as well, you're probably going to learn more about your sort of gameplay and
Hmm.
your style
Like
as
you're gonna
well.
learn more about how you used to play the game because you never thought
Mhm.
about it in that way, that precisely. Like, unless you've done this analysis before for your current playstyle, even the one that's not working. Like you're gonna learn just so much about how you used to play, and just in doing that, you'll pick up just some things that you'll solve for yourself. You're like, oh, I'm doing this like pretty consistently, and that's was never a good way to do things, and
Right.
it's still not a good way to do things.
Yep. So once you're doing that, like you should see some improvement, right? And once again, we need a decent sample size as well. And during this process, or a little bit into this process, if you are able to, you should get an outside eye, or in this case, you should get a co-op
Do a
partner,
co-op
right?
with someone, a buddy, a
Right.
friend. I know it's
You
hard for us
want,
to find Hearthstone friends these days because
I know.
it's impossible to get anyone into this game. But there are people that exist. You can use the internet. If you're really brave, you can get Hearthstone Deck Tracker to record one of your games and then put it online on like Arena HS or something. People will evaluate your game. They will criticize you play by play. Like people are willing to do that for you, and if you have thick enough skin for it, you can learn a lot.
During this process, though, so when we normally talk about just a co-op partner, we're saying, somewhat around your skill level. When you're doing this, though, you do want someone at least as good as you, they can definitely help you, identify a couple things. But to make this process just as smooth as possible, you want, if you're averaging 6 wins, you want someone pretty much like averaging at least 6 wins,
Yeah, just somewhere
Um,
around you. They don't even have to add like if you're averaging 6 wins, someone who's 5 wins, totally fine. Because just you having to explain what you're doing to them will make you think twice about it.
yeah, yeah. And even if you don't have anyone you can do that with right now, I see a lot of people asking on the Arena HS subreddit, or just on forums as well, and people are very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Usually there's someone, a very good arena player, who will volunteer and step up, maybe not for like 10 runs or 5 runs, but they'll be like, yeah, yeah, let's jump in a game,
Yeah.
and let's talk about it. So that's really helpful as well. And basically, with this last step, it's not really so much of a step as a continuing process, right? And by doing this, fixing a couple of things at a time, and then going back and seeing, well, okay, so let's go back and then let's try to see any other trends, right? Like, well, I've noticed that my warlock is still lagging behind. My warlock is still bad, and the consensus seems to be warlock is really not that bad in this meta. It's like one of the better classes.
Warlock
So,
sucks.
like, if a lot of people are posting good results with it, but I'm not, well, maybe there's something I can be doing that's
Okay,
better.
to be
And
fair,
then
I still have no
you
idea
go
how to
for
play
it.
Warlock in this meta. Like, that's like a defined weakness that I know in this meta. Every time I try to play Warlock, I don't know how to draft after I have the deck. I think I know how to play, but then the results are like, oh, I got 7 wins. I guess that's okay. And I'm like, I think I should be doing better with all these good cards. And sometimes I go in with like what I think is a good deck, and it's like 2 wins. All right, go Warlock. I don't know. Anyway, that was my random interjection on why you should not feel bad if you're not understanding Warlock in this meta.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because I also
Yes.
don't understand Warlock in this meta.
But this is this kind of the cycle that you go through, right? And past this, like what we're talking about at first, this will happen sometimes after a big event, right? A big event that's easily identifiable, like an expansion comes out and micro adjustments or everything. And sometimes you're just going to hit a slump. And I think it's easier for people to accept this process or accept something like this when something big happens, like an expansion comes out or like a big patch comes out. It's harder for people to do something like this when it's just in the middle of the meta and it's not even a micro adjust, right? And then people see a slump. But I think it's always an important process, right? Like this should not come right after some external influence that makes you say, okay, yeah, it makes sense that this happens. Like, I'm not saying it'll always work. I'm not saying you'll always find something. I mean, I basically did this during the initial period of the OG meta, and I couldn't really find anything. I was like, I don't know. I think I'm playing like everyone else. I think I'm doing quite similar things, but for like a good month. And this is back when we played a ton, actually. This is when we actually played a lot. Not like now where we play like 2 runs every week. But yeah, I was averaging like 5. It dipped down to like high 4s at a certain point.
Yeah, that was really sad.
It was real sad. It was real sad. And yeah, I was playing some like bad classes.
No, you're playing all classes evenly.
Yeah, I was playing like some bad classes, but it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't. And so I will say, just don't get frustrated because with any process and with any game that has RNG, sometimes you just don't figure it out and you just have to keep on sticking with it, right? And if you keep on sticking with it, you'll eventually get number 1 NA.
Yes,
there
we go. That's clearly, I just need to stick with it more. Just haven't stuck with it enough. So let's bring it like a little more onto this. I was talking about before, like how to judge your speed. That's something I like to do. I got 2 more tips in terms of just like very solid things you can look for. That's like on the easier side and that affects everybody. So the second part is your mulligan, and I don't mean like every mulligan you like pour over it and then you determine whether you did it right or not. Instead, like, don't even worry about what you're mulliganing. Like, do that normally, but then just observe what your opponent's playing on the first 3 turns, and like create this mental stat chart in your head, or like start just writing it down. Like, did my opponent play a 2-drop? Was it a 3-2, a 2-2, a 2-3, or whatever? And then mark some chances. Like, you'll get a pretty large, like not like large, but a good enough personal sample size with like just a few runs. Because this is a situation that will literally happen every single game you play, right? Win or lose, doesn't matter. And with that information, you can figure out whether you need to like coin the 3, right? Or whether you can skip a turn 2, or whether if you used a coin earlier, whether it'll hurt you later to fill out your curve. Like, that's I feel like people aren't as precise about it. Like, they have this vague idea of what people are playing, and then they just keep doing whatever it is that they're doing, and maybe they draft a little differently or whatever. But the use of the coin is so important, like, as player 2, because you don't really have much else. And so I feel like almost every time I coach someone, they may be getting the rest of the game like 70%, 80% right, but they're getting the mulligan like 50%, and like the first like 2 turns, right, like 50% wrong. Like, I always have disagreements with people I'm coaching on like the first 3 turns of the mulligan. And sometimes the mulligan's like, kind of, just playing odds on like 55% versus 45%. But then once you have cards in your hand, it's pretty, you can actually like math out like correct answers that, are like 70-30% chances. And they would take the 30% chance on no reason, then that's just what they're most comfortable with, which is what you can identify if you are actually looking at it. And again, what's the right choice in one meta is not in another meta, and the first few turns is a huge part of that, especially these days. These days, the first few turns of how you mulligan are changing very fast.
Yep.
And then finally, going back to the life management episode that we did last week, your life, like what you do about your opponent's early threat and like how you deal with aggro control. I think that's the way I think about it. Is my opponent is now playing aggro control, whether it's inadvertent or that's just how his deck is set up. He has one small or mid-sized minion on the board, and he is just removing my stuff. Like, being able to gauge the percent chance that that is going to happen is one of those things that will save you a lot of a lot of health and help you value your health correctly, which again is important in this meta, probably more so than others. But it's also something that you can track every single game that you're not on the board. So
Yep.
Yeah, those are just some starting points for which you can start doing your analysis if you're having some trouble and trying to recenter your own game.
Just stick with it, guys. The good will like enjoy the good times, but ride out the bad times.
Well,
that's basically it.
All right, moving on from Deep Fried Meta. Question from the GOAT. What do we have?
Question from the GOAT was submitted about half an hour ago.
Oh, wow. Cutting it close.
By S. Alessandro 3, asking, I was wondering, when you guys do your arena analyses and say things like the counter meta, if you could mention specific cards more, or give a little more of your reasoning why it is a, quote, counter meta. I understand, for example, I understand Psychic Scream exists, but that's only one card. Basically, would it be possible to go a little more in depth on why a specific meta is a specific type of meta?
Okay, so the meta, when we say counter meta, and again, it's never 100%. It's not like you switch from one meta to another and everything you know about the arena is done for, right? And you have to replace it with a whole new set of knowledge. If it were like that, I would not play the arena. That would be too much change. Instead, it's shifting, right? And we try to find the best phrase to describe how the meta has shifted. And one of the ways the primary way I think the meta has shifted in KNC is that it's become more about countering what your opponent does. So counters are reactive, right? Like even a removal is a counter. Taunts could sometimes be counters, but generally they're in the form of removals. And a counter meta and countering counters involves a lot of very specific conditions being met, right? Like you can't just play a Frostbolt. Your opponent has to have a minion. That's a very, very small condition, right? So if you listen to our episode that's about the counter meta, we put a lot of emphasis on just how the conditions for each trigger is met. And each card has a condition, each reactive card has a condition, and when the swings of the reactive cards are big enough, your incentive to play the counter or to bait the counter or to wait for the counter gets bigger because your chance to win from losing position becomes bigger. And when those conditions that has to be met become more ubiquitous, become more commonplace, become like a wider set, then it also pays more to play the counter meta because your downside is also lower. You'll whiff less frequently. And both of these things have become true in this meta, not just with Psychic Scream. You can look at Dragon Slayer, you can look at Cube, which we'll talk about after on Card Good Bad afterwards. You can look at mages with drafting and big spells. You can look at just so many things in this set, right? Like they are very large swinging if either you have the setup correctly or accidentally.
Yeah, I want to focus on the last part of your question when you ask, basically, why is a specific meta, right? So let's break down what makes up the meta. And I understand, we throw this word around so often. This is the meta, that's the meta. Like you play this in the meta, you don't play this in the meta. So what determines a meta? And it's not always sort of like a very clear sort of one-way cause and effect kind of thing. But here are a lot of things that cause the meta. So number one, it's always what cards are being offered at what rate, right? The offering rates always are a factor that play a huge role in what the meta ends up becoming. And we always remember after that, a lot of it is about how human beings and people playing this game take that information and apply it,
Yes.
right? Because what you're doing
So when
is,
everyone's playing Hunter, you're in a Hunter meta.
right, exactly. So, and this is what meta is. It's like sort of the analysis and gaming that's taken out of the direct game itself,
It's what
right?
happens before you enter the game.
Yeah. So when we look at like offering rates, and then we look at, all right, so what do people do because of this,
Mm-hmm.
and what are they capable of doing, and more so, what do they want to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's how a meta is formed, by sort of all of these factors put together. It's about like what the game offers and how people directly respond, and what they want to do here. So when and this is how any sort of meta is formed. So when we talk about like an aggro meta, what are these people thinking to collectively form an aggro meta? They look at the cards, and they say, wow, like, okay, we have these cards like Haunted Creeper, like Glaive Zuka,
Mm-hmm.
that are really good and over tempoed, for like that give a
Zombie
lot of tempo.
Chow,
Yeah, Zombie Chow. They give a
Mech
ton of
Warper.
yeah, Mech Warper, Piloted Shredder, right? It's like,
Oh,
wait.
Piloted Shredder Nightmares.
Right. They're like, wait. It's like on the other side, you have like Boulder Fist Ogre, but on the beginning
Mm,
side, you have Haunted Creepers, Piloted Shredders, Glaive Zukas,
yeah.
right? And they're just like, okay, it seems like the beginning of the curve has a lot of these powerful cards, and if I draft that, like that gives me an edge because I can get out fast, and it seems like whoever gets out faster can snowball as well. It's like people's recognition of the fact, and them implementing
Yeah.
it. That's what causes a meta.
And it happens that way not because everyone's like a deck scientist and figuring this out. And it doesn't happen this way because a particular drafter program is pushing everyone one way. It happens this way because people just see what's beating them. And if something's just working, you're gonna get beat by it fair. Like, how do we know that hunters were so good, right? It's because you saw these good hunter cards, and we're like, oh, hunters are good. But then you play the game, and you're like, oh, hunters are everywhere, and they're in all the high win rates, and I'm getting destroyed by hunters who aren't even playing good. And you're like, well, then hunters must be good. How are they good? Well, they're doing normal hunter things a bit slower, but more importantly, it seems like they're really good because they have a lot of big swings now, right? Like, if you go back to talk about why it's a counter meta, like Lesser Jasper Spellstone was a huge culprit in the early going because it's a pure swing, right? You get just so much extra tempo if you set it up correctly in your hand that's unstoppable. Corridor Creeper, same thing. It's just so many cards, right? Every Spellstone, also, even though they're probably not as good as Lesser Jasper Spellstone, but if you can set them up, it does the same thing. Void Ripper, right? That's like dragons, right? Like all these things are just very much flippy and very much requires a specific condition to be met and then does something really big. So what you're trying to do more now is try to make that specific condition be met than before when you're playing more of like a macro game of like, I'm going to have this much tempo when I do this trade, I gain this much tempo and card advantage and that stuff.
Yep. So that's how a meta is formed. Like, and regarding the question, yeah, a lot of times we'll talk about one card, right? Because it is something that is being played by the most popular class, and it's sort of meta defining in a way, right? So in the question mentions Psychic Scream, but just recognize, even though we talk about it a lot, Psychic Scream does not sort of form the meta.
The
It is
only time a card formed the meta that I can remember, like that,
Portal.
not like a class card. The only time I can remember a
Yeah.
class card do it was Firelands Portal.
Yeah, that was the only time. But also because back then
They also had
it
Faceless
was
Summoner.
yeah, well it was because it was in an adventure,
Yeah,
right?
it was
Which we don't have
Karazhan.
anymore. It was an adventure, and they bumped it up.
Yep, it was like 200% offering rate.
It was 200%.
Yeah,
So that was really dumb. You were like every single mage
had like two
was
Firelands.
you average like 2 point something,
No,
something,
this is
right?
not even, you average like less than two, but like around two.
Okay, yeah. So you basically get like
But like
two
that's
fire
average. So like if
No,
you're in
that's
like
average.
7-0, for example, your mages have like 4 Firelands portals.
Yep. So all they have to do is just get like a few River Crocs, maybe
Mm-hmm.
one or two Yetis, and then the portals will win the game for
Yeah.
them. That's basically it. But anyways, yeah. So Don't focus on the fact that when we talk a lot about Psychic Scream. So Alessandro, your question is basically like, wait, but that's just one card, and it's totally accurate. Psychic Scream is an embodiment of the meta. It is not the driver of the meta, because the driver of the meta is just the community and
Mm-hmm.
how they've identified the cards and how they're playing it. So that's what we're talking about here, and hopefully that gives you a better idea of how this is formed. Because you're right, we don't really talk about how it is formed. We talk about this is the meta now.
Yep. Okay, so that's Question from the GOAT, brought to you by patrons. Patreon.com/GrinningGoat. Thank you guys so much for supporting us. It keeps the light on here at the Lightforge podcast. And let's move on to Card Good Bad before we talk about Warrior. Card Good Bad. This one I picked. It's Carnivorous Cube. It's a 143 on our tier list. It's pretty much been around there since the expansion first launched. We haven't really moved it around that much. It's a complicated card on one hand. On the other hand, it's pretty straightforward. You just like double a minion, but it becomes the death rattle of this like 4/6 that your opponent will never ever ever kill. So it gets like delayed quite a lot. But the reason that it's so high, I think, is obvious, right? It's because whatever tempo you lose from cubing something, you get it back as soon as you can kill this, and you just get pure card advantage. And then if you can combo it with something with a death rattle, for example, it becomes insane, and you can effectively heal up stuff. Like, there's so many tricky uses to this, and it's a very good constructed card for that reason. Now, I don't know what the win rate for this card is. I haven't looked it up, but I assume it's not this high. I assume it's actually quite pedestrian. I don't even know if it's better than a neutral 4/6. Because this is a card, and I've seen it happen over and over again, even at high win rates, that's just begging to be misplayed. Right? Like, it's your classic, like, Brewmaster scenario mixed on top of that with your Ascetic Swampu scenario, where it moves something off of your board, which people generally do ill-advised. Like, they'll always try to get the value, even when they should really just tempo it by like making a trade before playing it, or like cubing the smaller thing rather than the larger thing. Or they'll hold on to this card forever, waiting to have something on the board that they can cube to some effect, instead of just being like, hey, it's a 5-mana 4/6, I'm okay with that. So the win rates for this, I think, is going to be a little iffy in the arena. But a good player should be able to make this card very good by recognizing when it's just a 5-mana 4/6.
Yeah, and there's a decent percentage of time that you just play as a 5-mana 4/6. The one thing when we deal with cards with upside, like Carnivorous Cube, is to just detach yourself from the quote lost value sometimes, right? Sometimes you have to play Argent Protector on 2. Sometimes Cube is not going to eat anything at all. And you just have to sort of deal with something like this, or and just don't think about the value that you've given up, because you're from that point your baseline is like the best case scenario, right?
Yep.
Which you should never make your baseline. You have lost a little bit of value, you move on, because that is your best play at the best time. It's just always about the best play at the best time.
Yeah, it's not like you lost the value. You never had the value. You just had the potential for the value, and as the game turns out, you don't have that value. And if you hold it, the value is going to keep going down. So there's a very sophisticated system in the algorithm right now that's like determining which turn, like each turn, how much value each card like has. And it doesn't do a lot for things like Yeti. But for things like Carnivorous Cube, it's like analyzing board states like crazy. Like, it knows when you want to cube something, when you don't want to cube something, what the values for each of these are, how they do in each board state, how that differs turn by turn, how much burning a hole in your hand, like, you know, affects the value of the card, and like when you would actually be playing this card. So it's doing a lot of things, and it's helping other cards too. But this is one of those like prime candidates for this kind of analysis. And I've gone through like this thing like line by line of like, you know, on this turn, in this situation, and it all lines up. So it's a good card, and you're going to see this so often of your opponents just cubing one of their own minions and then dying before their cube ever dies. Anytime you cube your own minion, and you lose the game before your cube dies, you've screwed up. You should not have cubed your minion. That's a very basic line. Now, if you cube your own minion and you win the game before the cube dies, that's fine. Because what that means is you've made your opponent not want to kill the cube, and you didn't feel pressured enough that you had to kill your own cube for value. So you were protecting against board clears, you were protecting against all sorts of stuff. But what happens so often is I kill the opponent after they cube their own thing. And the bigger of a thing you cubed when that happens, when you lose with the cube still on the board, the worse of a decision you made. Right? Like if you cubed a 1-1, because also like sometimes you have to cube something, right? Like you don't just get to like choose to cube nothing if you have stuff on the board. So sometimes you have to decide whether this is the right turn to play the cube or if losing the tempo is too bad. And I would rather have like a 4-5 on the board than a 4-6, and I'll just play the 4-5 and then I wait till I'm off the board and then I can play the 4-6 for tempo.
Yep. All right. I think that's a good breakdown of the cube.
Like play around with it, and more importantly, just watch your opponents with the cube, because you're only gonna have so many experiences with the cube. It's an epic card. But your opponents are going to miscube all the time. And one of the easiest wins is to identify when your opponent miscubes and just be like, now I'm going to push and never touch this cube. And you are going to lose because you have like whatever board lead you had, you just purposefully taken it away from yourself until your cube dies, which will be in like 3 turns because I'm not going to let you kill your cube for a while. Okay, so let's end this with a link to what we're going to do right after this, which is an Arena Cube Warrior. You have played a crap ton of Warrior. You are now the official Warrior expert in the Grinning Goat. So tell us, Merps, KNC Warrior, what is happening besides the micro adjusts, which we know are against the Warrior, but like worst class?
Yeah, and I'll say it's the worst class because it's hardest to get a winning deck. And a winning deck is very different from good cards, right? Because micro adjusts are definitely trying to get Warriors good cards. But the problem is, in order to have a winning deck with Warrior, there's basically only one way to win with Warrior, which is like either like you could define it as tempo, or you could define it as like aggro control, right? Like something like that, in which you need the early stuff, and then you need to follow it up with weapons, right? And then you just want to be able to snowball like that, because if you're able to do that, and this pretty much holds true for every expansion, if you are able to do that, you win like every single game because weapons are just that good, right? So if you're able to put down minion turn after turn, and on key turns weapon out, if you've put down like a 1, 2, 3, 4, and then on 5 you put out Fool's Bane, it's over. It's like the game's just over, essentially. But the problem is drafting something like that, and then also going into the game and drawing and playing that, right? And what I've seen, and what I've seen the micro just try to do is, they try to give Warriors like these cards that are good, but not necessarily cohesive towards a winning deck. A winning deck, it wants like
they can't give it a cohesive thing. They don't have the technology for that without a human being actually like messing with things.
Right. So they will offer me like four Fool's Banes, right? Which I'm just like, that's an amazing card, but I can't even take more than 2, because I'm also just not. I'm not like just taking Fool's Banes as well, right? I'm also taking other weapons, so I really can't take that much. And it seems like I'm always getting Gorehouse, right? I'm always getting like all of these weapons, and there are many times in which I just have like 4 weapons in my hand, and I can't do anything. I can only swing once. Also, if they made you be able to dual wield, that would be cool, but I can only swing once a turn as well. So it just gets into this awkward situation where you need the curve. You need the weapons, but you also need like the right amount of weapons, right? You can't have too much. You obviously can't have too little, so you have to hit that. And then as for the minions, you can't have like way too small, but you obviously can't have like way too big as well. It's not like priests, in which they can be like, oh, my spells can be small, and I'm gonna have like a lot of big minions as well as like big spells like mind control and
Hmm.
and it's like I have a clear path to go. The offering rates sort of favor this, and just sort of the cards favor it as well. And it's easy for me to just fall into this kind of draft as a priest. It's very hard for you to fall into a good warrior deck.
Hmm.
And that's basically it. Like if you try to play too aggro, you'll just get wiped. And if you try to play control, like you're gonna get beat by priests. Like the warriors just cannot outvalue priests or
So here's the thing with warriors playing control. You have no board clears. You have no board clears, so your opponent knows that. Your opponent knows that
yeah.
because you're a warrior. You're just flashing a giant sign to your opponent that says, "I have no board clears. Go for it." So your opponent is actually going to tempo out much harder than they normally do, right? They're not going to play this value game that they would play against a priest. And if they don't play the value game that they play against the priest, you're going to get overrun pretty quick. So just by being a warrior, you're subjecting yourself to like 25% more face damage than a priest, and 25% more stuff on the board that your opponent's willing to play. And to top it all off, you have no way to punish them except Fool's Bane. And Fool's Bane can be used like once effectively and take the face damage. And then you're like, no more. That's it. And even if you're on the board, like that's Control Warrior, right? That's why Control Warrior doesn't work. The only way Control Warrior works is if you have like the most absurd amount of taunts ever. Because that's all you got going for you. You just got to keep taunting up and forcing them to trade. Because you can't get your 2-for-1s in any other way. And then you have to hope they don't have removals, right? Like it's all very passive, all very not in your control, which you don't want to do as a good player generally. So you're
Right.
back to this warrior aggro thing, and we all know aggro doesn't work as well now as it used to, not only because of all the defensive cards, but because it just swings more, right? So if you have a more aggro deck and it swings against you, what are you going to do? How are you going to get the board back? Aggro involves snowballing stuff. You've lost your stuff to snowball because they swung. Like you don't have a way to swing back. Again, for warrior, all you get is Fool's Bane.
When you look at good classes for any specific meta, part of the consideration, past whether or not the cards are good, is always how forgiving is drafting this type of deck or this class, right? Like how easy is it to just draft that class? And right now for priests, like Adukta sort of jokes around with it, but it's also you could honestly just pick the best card,
Mm-hmm.
right? Take the best card, and you can win quite a lot with priest. In like we talked about with mage in the Firelands portal meta, just take all the Firelands portals and then just take like some mid game and early game,
A
and you're good to
vague
go.
curve.
Yeah. So right now with warrior, it's like really tough. You're walking a tightrope, and even when you're aware of this and you try to walk the tightrope, lots of times you'll still get screwed by the draft. So that's sort of where warrior is right now. And I've seen quite a few individuals like, no, warrior is good. Like
No.
I've gotten these results as well.
Mm-mm.
Look, it's certainly possible to get some good results. It's just if you look at the overall win rate, and you look at sort of how good players are doing with warrior as well. Is it possible to do well with warrior? Sure, but it just doesn't have the consistency that other classes have.
Yep. So definitely still the worst class in a meta where the classes are pretty even. The class that was like kind of there with warrior but still better noticeably is shaman, and now shaman's okay. Shaman's like definitely like in the mix now as a usable class because they bumped up all the shaman, like the great shaman stuff. We talked about it before. The more you bump up warriors, Fool's Bane doesn't really matter. So I mean, it does matter, but only up to a certain point, and we've way past that point. So that's warrior. If you're thinking about playing the warrior, it's not like totally not viable. Like the win rates aren't horrible. Your experiences with it are not like horrible. It's still a fun class to play, but it's a weird class to play now because of the micro adjusts. Like you don't know what you're getting yourself into. It's Blizzard. They still call them micro adjusts, so I still call them micro adjusts. We should just call them like adjusts or like auto adjusts. Like
offering rate adjustments.
Yeah,
because
there's nothing micro about them when they're like the equivalent of things Blizzard actually tells us, right? Like Blizzard will tell us something that's being 50%ed, and that's what the micro and macro adjusts are. So they're just auto adjusts. All right. Anything you want to say before we end this podcast and you go on your vacation?
That's it. That is it. Yeah. Right now we're sort of in the middle-ish of the middle. Well, yeah. We obviously expect more adjustments to happen to the offering rate, but I think what we talked about today is a good topic because lots of people are struggling, and it's easy to look at all of this and just be like, throw your hands up in the air and just be like, look, everyone is struggling. It's not me, or this is just too much, right? And I, I think it's very easy to also just like for that to take away your enjoyment of the game. And if you're playing the arena, and if you're listening to this podcast, like you obviously enjoy sort of the challenge of getting better, right? Like the challenge of overcoming sort of obstacles in the way of opponents or the meta. And we just want to sort of refocus and be like, okay, there's a lot of frustration going on. Here are just the proactive steps everyone should be taking in order to get out of a slump, which everyone will be in at a certain point.
Yep. And remember, if you're losing by if you're like a 7-win player and you're down half a win, that's not a big deal. The whole leaderboard's down like a half win. This is not the meta to get the ridiculous high win rates. But if you're in like a 1.5 win slump or like I said, right, a 20% or more slump, then you should think about recentering your game. All right, until next week, this is Adwick Duck.
This is Merp. See you guys.
See ya.